afternoon.
Nice to meet you.
And you.
I wonder if we can begin our conversation by asking you to give an overview of your research.
My research has focused on bilingualism and the brain and aphasia, as those are interlinked.
Okay.
So one of my larger projects has been to look at how aphasia manifests across different languages, particularly the type of aphasia called agrammatism, where it's morphology that's affected, and because morphology differs so much from language to language, agrammatism manifests differently across those different languages. So Lisa Men and I put together a team that collected data across 14 languages, and then I've had some students working with me afterwards, looking at different languages of agrammatism. With respect to aphasia more broadly speaking, I've been involved in research most recently on people who are bilingual or multilingual and have aphasia, and how that aphasia may be treated. One of the questions that people have been focusing on is, if you treat in one language, does that affect the other language? This has both pragmatic implications for the particular individuals who are getting aphasia rehabilitation, but also theoretical implications of great interest to the question of how language is organized in the brain of bilinguals, multilinguals. So I've also moved to working on language changes of healthy aging, because older adults will complain about problems with remembering the names of things or other words they need, names of people in particular, of course, and will complain about troubles hearing, although we do expect that people have more hearing problems, but these manifest as comprehension problems that seem to be brain-based as well as ear-based, to put it coarsely.
Okay, very good.
So that work on language in healthy elderly has interacted with my work on language changes in dementia, which are not exactly the same as the language changes of aphasia, but not unrelated either. So those are the primary areas I've worked in.
During the course of your research and the course of your career, what impacts, what were some of the major accomplishments in both your language research and that of the wider field from the time you started in the 70s until now?
It seems to me the wider field has become much more aware of bilingualism as a phenomenon, much more aware of how the different structures, particularly morphological structures associated with individual languages, have influence on the way language gets performed, particularly, but not only, after aphasia, when that happens. There's also been an expanding of the notion of who is worthy of studying and comparing, both in terms of diversity within our Western cultures, across languages, across countries, and across diseases, neurological diseases. So much more work on dementia and the various sorts of dementia, not only Alzheimer's dementia. Oh yeah, and much more focus on healthy aging and the language changes associated with healthy aging, which were entirely ignored in the 1970s.
I see. And so what are some of the impacts then on people's lives that have emerged from your research and the research in the wider field?
With respect to the impact for people, I've also seen a substantial change in the impact of research on bilingualism generally. So not just, but also definitely including psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics on the Western world's appreciation of bilingualism as a positive phenomenon in the years I've been in the field, and is something a culture benefits by and would want to enhance in any way possible. And I think there's an impact on education as well, on the assumptions that we shouldn't tell families who have a choice between bringing up their kids bilingual because they have a home language that's not the dominant language, these would be children of immigrants, to tell them no, 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 even if the child may seem to have a language delay, to rush to tell them, no, speak only one language. The dominant language is going to be the one you need to know. That's an impact that science has brought about, contributed to, importantly, I think. Another one has to do with rehabilitation for aphasia and dementia, particularly aphasia, but there's certainly work happening today on rehabilitation for dementia. In terms of how people have been helped, there's much more scientific testing of which types of rehabilitation work for which patients with aphasia.
Right.
And that holds true for monolinguals as well as for bilinguals. Treatments have been developed, and education has permitted speech-language pathologists and others to think of what evidence-based practice would be and to implement it to the aid of those who are coming to see them.
So when you first began your research, what were the key focuses of inquiry, and how have those key focuses changed over time?
Yeah. In the work on aphasia, there was a lot of focus on particular cases and finding the links between language, performance, and brain regions in the left hemisphere, in the classical regions that have been associated with aphasia, namely Broca's area, Wernicke's area, and the arcuate fasciculus that connects them. That was the primary focus, although the truth is a number of the phenomena that we're going to be talking about that have come into focus, have actually come today, have come into refocus because there were people like Wernicke and Pick asking questions that went beyond those foci. There was even people like Alzheimer who was looking, among other things, at the language changes associated with Alzheimer's disease. With respect to bilingualism, there was very little work on the neurolinguistics of bilingualism, very little work. A few questions about whether there were more left-handers among bilinguals, few people looking at that, through looking at people who got aphasia as a result of some aphasia-inducing incident from a right hemisphere lesion, which we wouldn't necessarily expect. And then there was just starting out a series of studies using the technology we had available at the time, namely tachistoscopes and dichotic listening. So a lot of questions about the relative interaction of right and left hemispheres in bilingualism with no resolution whatsoever.
How much do we really know or really understand about the brain and bilingualism? And you know, how far have we come with our understanding, and what do we still need to know about that?
Bilingualism is such an interesting phenomenon to those of us in countries where not everyone is bilingual, more for me in the US than for you in Canada, of course, but it can be compelling, of course, in countries and cultures where people are bilingual or multilingual. The things we've come to understand about bilingualism and the brain are, it's pretty clear that very similar areas of the brain are devoted to language processing for each of one's languages. That's true at the gross level, or it's primarily the left hemisphere that's involved, certainly in languages one has high proficiency in. It's also true at smaller brain regions that have been identified. Whether it's true at the cellular level, we simply don't know today. Or what exactly is true at the cellular level, we really don't know today.
What advice would you give students or junior colleagues in the field?
I think it's important for everyone to have a good sense of today's understanding of the neuroanatomy and the neurophysiology of the brain, and to master one of the techniques that have fallen out to be regularly used in the field today. That certainly was not the case when I was coming up in the field in the 1970s. And two, I'd have people learn about aphasia and the phenomena of aphasia, but go well beyond that. So starting in 1982 with Marcel Mesulam, a new pattern was seen. Now, it had been referred to by Pick in the 1930s, I think, or maybe in 1919. A new pattern was brought to our attention of primary progressive aphasia. So moving beyond looking at the classical types of aphasia to the types that bring us to that question of cognition. That would be important for a student to be aware of and to have some awareness of dementia, even if that's not going to be the primary area they focus on, or perhaps they will find it's an important area to focus on. And linked to that, knowing more about cognition, taking the neurocognition sorts of courses where language is considered to be just another sort of cognition. I would beg to differ as a linguist, to be able to think about and study how cognitive underpinnings contribute to language processes.
Good. Just a couple more quick questions for you. How have your values as a researcher, as a language researcher, how have your values changed over the course of your career?
Coming from linguistics, where we have a general stance, or certainly had a general stance, that a linguist's job should be to observe a corpus of one sort or another and see what patterns are happening, where, extract them partly through intuition and then confirming it. That's a very different approach to a field from one that a psychologist would have, where you get to a question in one of the various ways you get to a question and develop careful hypotheses and ways for quantifying what it is you're going to learn. And maybe even in the strict cases, choose to ignore interesting patterns that you didn't ask questions about to begin with. That has been important for me to understand as an approach without giving up on the one that says, hey, when you see an interesting phenomenon, even if it isn't what you went in looking for, see if you can verify that it's actually happening and figure out what might have been going on and pass the information along to others and see if you want to build on what it is you've found, rather than saying, no, we weren't planning to look at it, so we're not going to count. Same with the use of 0.05 as a cutoff criterion. It makes me annoyed when people say X was not significant and they don't tell us whether that means it was 0.06, the difference between two things. I always say, if someone tells you there's a 94% chance it's going to rain today, you take an umbrella. You don't say, at 6% chance it won't happen, right?
Right.
And I only take an umbrella when there's a 5% chance that there won't be rain. It seems to me one of the things that's been true actually since early in my work in the field, but then I was fortunate to be at the Aphasia Research Center, that what's now the Harold Goodglass Aphasia Research Center in Boston, is to have teams that include linguists, of course, I'm going to put first, speech language pathologists, psychologists, particularly with the knowledge of assessment, and also psycholinguists with the knowledge of language processing, a neurologist when we're talking about people with named conditions of neurological changes, and did I leave someone out? And statisticians, because sometimes one can be really impressed with an apparent link or change, and it turns out to just be random. So it's important to be kept honest in that way.
I am so curious. The Twitters, the Facebooks, the 30-second videos, the way that information is bombarding us. Is it changing our brains? Is it making memory recall of words more difficult? Is it and is that are young brains structured differently than older brains, let's say, to be able to process this information quickly and retrieve it and put it into words? And
to the extent that I firmly believe that how we use language and our bodies influences how we're able to use it, then it must be the case. For one of the easy ones would be to say, for people who are using their thumbs to type, rather than those primarily, rather than those of us who are using our whole hands, we can certainly expect there will be more robust regions associated with thumbs in the brain for the people who do a lot of texting as compared to those who don't. We've seen that with, say, musicians, that various instruments will have an effect on how the physical parts of the body that work them have organized structures in the brain for them. With respect to language in particular, spelling some people worry about, right? As being less important, pragmatics and the ability to read what the other person in the Skype we're with is saying or thinking. I can't judge that.
Okay, is there anything else that you would like, anything that we've missed asking you in terms of your career from the beginning to the present, in terms of the wider field, in terms of advice you can give junior colleagues, anything of that nature, anything else that you would like to pass on to the people who are watching this video?
I guess another of the changes that I've really seen is a greater sensitivity to including people who might otherwise be underrepresented among the participant population and ideally among the student and therefore the research population. And that can only be a good thing because of all the aspects of diversity that we've been talking about in the course of this conversation. So always keeping that in the back of one's mind as one sets up a program, as one sets up funding for research, seems to me can only benefit our societies. What fun it's been. Gary promised me it would be fun having these discussions.
Oh, very interesting talking to you and learning from you. And if my colleagues have any other questions, I think we've covered all the ground that we
Okay.
need to
Goodbye, Gary. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to say goodbye to everyone too.